All right, now what Charles Barkley says often resonates, and certainly these comments have. The question is it positive or negative? Let's bring in Marc Lamont Hill, CNN political commentator, host of HuffPost Live, and professor at Morehouse College. HuffPost Live. I think I said HuffPost Live.
Is that Freudian?
What was that about? We're always competitive. So it's great to have you here, Professor. Let me ask you this. First of all, does Charles Barkley deserve criticism for what he said?
Absolutely.
Why?
And anyone who says that deserves it. It's not because it's Charles Barkley. Because I think it's not nuanced, and I think it misses some of the point. To call people jackasses, to sort of dismiss the quote-unquote looters out of hand without really sort of thinking about what they're going through at that moment, I think it's problematic. You can condemn bad behavior, but I think it's too simple to say that. Also, his defense of the police, to me, was somewhat puzzling and bizarre.
All right, so let's unpack it one by one. He said a lot of things.
Yeah.
He called looters scumbags. Why is that wrong? It's an ugly word. It's not a productive word. But when you talk about that segment of the population, not the protesters, not those who were there who would voice their outrage and exercise their rights, but who just took on straight criminal activity, why should they not be condemned roundly?
Well, I think there's a difference between condemning people and calling them scumbags. Scumbags goes beyond. I think there's something about dehumanizing people that makes it easier to see the types of police action that we saw out there. That's a problem for me. Say, look, I wish they'd made different choices. If you think they should be prosecuted, make that claim. It's a little bit different. But
for your business, would you be saying, I wish they'd made different choices? You think you'd be calling them scumbags?
I mean, I stood in Ferguson. Bullets whizzed past me. I was in a store while it was set on fire. I was very much in imminent danger, and I still have the same claim that I have right now. It wasn't my business, but I certainly felt the brunt of what happened.
All right, so he says cops in general are awesome. In the ghetto, they're the only thing that keeps it from being the wild, wild west. We do have to be careful in these discussions not to demonize all cops, right? They are very useful, but you bristled when he said that as well. Why?
Because it goes back to the dehumanizing piece. Again, as if black people are these savages and these animals, and the only thing stopping black people from murdering each other is the presence of police. Again, he seems to have this huge defense of police, this hurried defense of police, and not the same of vulnerable black people. And let's not forget, it's riots, it's unrest, it's all that stuff that has us talking about Michael Brown. Black people die every day. Oftentimes, black people die at the hands of law enforcement, and we don't have national stories about it. It's the uprisings in Ferguson that made us talk about this, yet somehow Charles Barkley can rationalize choking out Eric Garner by saying, oh, he resisted. You can resisting is not what you're supposed to do, but you're also not supposed to be choked out. He can defend police in Ferguson.
Right. I want to talk more about Eric Garner, but first there's another point that's on the table that often gets ignored, but why should we? It's okay what Barkley says because he's black. And that's a lot of the cover he gets. If I went on TV and said those things, I'd have a long day in the boss's office. Barkley will not. Is it okay that he's black, and that's why he gets to say these things?
Well, look, again, black people are not monolithic. Black people have a variety of opinions, and I want to hear all of them. But I do think it's interesting that they constantly go to Charles Barkley for commentary on things like that, and I think it's because he can offer an opinion that can't be offered by mainstream white people, even if it's oftentimes the exact same opinion. No one goes to John Stockton or Chris Mullen and says, hey, I wonder what you think about ISIS, right? But if there's a perspective that you want, Charles Barkley will offer it, and that's why media run it.
Is he a leader in the black community?
I mean, he's a role model, despite what he said in the past. He's someone people look to. He's someone people admire. I don't know if people look to him for political leadership.
All right, Eric Garner. The case, you could argue, has been ignored or overshadowed by Ferguson. It involved a handgun. It goes right to the heart, the Michael Brown killing of what is feared most about police in certain communities. But Eric Garner, there's video of it. They take him down. There's a chokehold. There's a big issue for the grand jury is whether or not it was a homicide. Charles Barkley actually nailed a very subtle legal point.
Accidentally.
No, I don't know. Brooks says, well, what do you mean? You see him get choked. He says, I don't think it was a homicide. A homicide is death caused by a person. And the issue before the grand jury, and again, it's going to be somewhat of an unshaped case by the prosecutor's office, will be whether or not the cops actually killed him or whether his heart did. What do you think happens if there's no indictment in Eric Garner's case?
I think you see more of what we've seen, more unrest. I'm not saying more rioting, but certainly more unrest, which
Why?
I think is because I think people are finally tired.
Of what?
Of black people dying at the hands of law enforcement. I really think it's that simple. And again, every case isn't the same. Sometimes there's resistance. Sometimes police are in legitimate danger.
You could argue Michael Brown was a bad case to hang the issue of whether or not cops are unfair to blacks because of the assault at the car, because of what had happened before the shooting. Is that a fair argument to make?
No, I think Michael Brown's actually the perfect case.
Perfect case.
I think too often when it comes to Black Death, we need the perfect case. We want the perfect shoot. We want the kid who's never stolen from the store, the kid who's never been suspended, the kid with no weed in the system. We want this perfect case to model. There's a long history of that in the civil rights movement. Claudette Colvin sat on the bus before Rosa Parks, but they said she's an unwed mother, so we can't go to her. We don't need perfect cases. We need cases that say that no matter who you are, whether you steal a cigar in a store, whether you may have been inappropriate with a cop at one moment, it's not a lethal offense. That's the point, and that's why Michael Brown's such a telling case for me.
Professor Marc Lamont Hill, thank you for being on.
My
Sorry
pleasure.
for changing the name of your show. You know it was unintentional.